Greetings to you all, and welcome to this hybrid policy exchange session. Joining us in London for this keynote speech are the Secretary of State for Defense, the Right Honorable Ben Wallace MP, and General Sir Nick Carter, the Chief of Defense Staff. And joining us via Zoom are over 1,000 virtual participants, hence the hybrid session. General Sir Nick is, of course, a fellow soldier with whom I've had the privilege of serving on operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the latter, he had more Americans under his command than any British commander since World War II, and I think more Americans under his command than any American commander in Afghanistan at that time. He did a masterful job then as commander of Regional Command South, as he did later as the deputy commander of the International Security Assistance Force. He is, in my view, an exceptional soldier, an impressive thinker, and a commendably forthright senior military leader. Policy Exchange is, of course, one of the leading think tanks in the world, a forum where new and challenging ideas are introduced to the public debate, many of which I've had the pleasure of being involved with over the past 11 or so years. And this afternoon is another example of Policy Exchange's unprecedented events. In more ways than one, I might note, as it is great to see a serving Secretary of State for Defense and a serving Chief of Defense Staff on a public stage together, something that I gather has been a bit of a novel experience in recent times. The integrated operating concept that General Sir Nick will present for the first time in a major public event today represents an important juncture for UK defense. That's because he'll lay out a new approach to the utility of armed forces and the integration of activities in outer space, cyberspace, and informational domains, along with those in the traditional air, land, and maritime domains. In an era of persistent competition, rapid evolution in the very character of warfare, and a return of great power rivalries, this new concept for operations represents a significant development in UK military thought and a fundamental transformation and employment of the military instruments. With that, allow me to hand off to the Secretary of State for Defense, noting that while he has, of course, been an MP and at various times a minister over the past 15 years, he is no stranger to soldiering. He completed Sandhurst, he earned a commission as an officer in the Scots Guards, and he was on active service during the 1990s in Northern Ireland, Germany, Cyprus, and Central America, earning a mention in dispatches in 1992. I also want to thank the Secretary for working recently with the Home Secretary to gain approval for 100 of the Afghan battlefield translators who served with British forces in Afghanistan to emigrate to the UK with their families, discharging what I think is a sacred obligation to those who have shared risk with soldiers on the battlefield. Their service has imperiled their safety and that of their families, and this is a wonderful action. Beyond that, I thank the Secretary as well for his efforts to strengthen legal protections for soldiers and veterans, an issue that the Policy Exchange and I have engaged in the past. Now over to the Secretary of State for Defense.
Thank you, General Petraeus, and thank you for the kind introduction to me. And you observed, General, that me and the Chief of Defence Staff are together on the stage. I think we work very well together. I'm very privileged to work with General Sir Nick Carter, and I think by working together, I think it allows us to reform both our armed forces and the Ministry of Defence to go forward for the rest of the century. It's really important that we learn our lessons and feed it in both at doctrine and indeed design. And I think I took the view early on that working so close to the Chief of Defence Staff is a really strong thing we can do if we're really going to make the difference, and we don't end up here in a few more years' time with another review starting all over again. There's been a lot written already about the integrated review, and it won't have missed many of you that the government is in the middle of a long and wide and deep integrated review into our foreign policy and defence and security policies in order to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Obviously in defence, our mission is to defend the nation, is to provide security to Britain, her allies, and our interests. But the problem with these reviews is they often boil down to numbers games and discussions about, equipment bingo, about who's going to buy what are we going to cut, and often forget to realise that our main task is to meet the threat. But also, just as important at the end of this review will be how we will conduct future warfare. How will we conduct the process of challenging both the competition and our adversaries? And that's what the integrated operating concept is all about. It's the how we're going to conduct modern warfare, both above and below the threshold. And that's why today this is such an important speech by General Nick Carter. Because we can buy all the things we want, or some of the things we want. We can redesign our armed forces, but if they're not put into practice, they're not made to be busier, they're not more engaging in getting out there in the world, being more present, being more challenging to our competition, then what is it all for? Now, I looked at this integrating operating concept, both in draft and indeed as it is presented today, and I wish I had this when I was a young officer. I would have found myself more busy, not just sandwiched between operations and then not a lot, not sitting in barracks waiting for the next Roermond battalion tour, but being able to be using all the skills at our disposal to strengthen Britain's defence, but also to make sure that we challenge our adversaries wherever they may be and in whatever guise they come. So without further ado, I'd be delighted to hand over to the Chief of Defence Staff and just to say that I think this is a real step change in how we're going to do business. Thank you. Sir Nick.
Secretary of State, thank you very much for those kind opening remarks, and General David, thank you for your remarks as well. I have to say it was one of the highlights of my career serving under your command in Afghanistan, and I learned a significant amount, so thank you for that. The Prime Minister, I think, has set a very clear vision for the future of global Britain, one where the UK is considered an outwardly looking internationalist country that acts as a burden-sharing and problem-solving nation, making a tangible contribution to tackling diplomatic and security challenges in our neighbourhood and beyond. To do this, though, and particularly from our perspective in defence, we must first understand that the threats to our national security, our values and our prosperity have evolved and diversified markedly. Our authoritarian rivals see the strategic context as a continuous struggle in which non-military and military instruments are used unconstrained by any distinction between peace and war. These regimes believe that they are already engaged in an intense form of conflict that is predominantly political rather than kinetic. Their strategy of political warfare is designed to undermine cohesion, to erode economic, political and social resilience, and to compete for strategic advantage in key regions of the world. Their goal is to win without going to war, to achieve their objectives by breaking our willpower, using attacks below the threshold that would prompt a warfighting response. These attacks on our way of life from authoritarian rivals and extremist ideologies are remarkably difficult to defeat without undermining the very freedoms we want to protect. We are exposed through our openness. The pervasiveness of information and rapid technological development have changed the character of warfare and of politics. We now have new tools, techniques and tactics that can be used to undermine political and social cohesion, and the means to make the connection to an audience ever more rapidly. Information is now democratized. It's available for everyone. Our adversaries have studied our Western way of war, identified our vulnerabilities, and modernized their capabilities to target them. The campaigns of the last 30 years have been played out over global media networks, from the first Gulf War in the early 1990s to the airstrikes in Bosnia and Kosovo, the response to the terrorist attacks on embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and of course the campaigns in Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya. All have been watched very closely by our rivals. They saw that air power could penetrate deep into hostile territory and learned that we preferred to fight and strike targets from afar. They saw that this enhanced our natural aversion to putting people in harm's way. They watched how casualties, financial cost and length of time swayed domestic and public opinion, and the effect that that had on the legitimacy assuring the use of armed force. So they learned how to improve their own resilience to absorb strikes. They developed anti-access denial systems. They improved their maritime undersea capabilities. They developed long-range missile systems. They integrated electronic warfare, swarms of drones with multiple fires, and used these to defeat armour. They invested in space and cyber, recognising the importance we attach to global positioning and digitisation. And in Ukraine and Syria, Russia has created battle laboratories from real-life events to develop their tactics and battle-harden a new generation of soldiers. The US Department of Defense's latest annual report to Congress on military and security developments involving the People's Republic of China highlights that the PRC has marshalled the resources, technology, and political will over the past 2 decades to strengthen and modernise the People's Liberation Army, including growing the largest maritime surface and subsurface battle force in the world, an armoury of ground-launched cruise and ballistic missiles, some of which have 10 times the range of conventional ballistic missiles, one of the world's largest forces of advanced long-range surface-to-air systems, and of course expanding their overseas military footprint. They have also harnessed technologies and tactics that have outpaced the evolution of international law to avoid their actions being classified as conflict under the current definitions of international law. Authoritative PLA texts have argued that the ambiguous boundary between peace and war opens up opportunities for the military to achieve its ends, disguising its activities as civilian and therefore peaceful. China's new Strategic Support Force is designed to achieve dominance in the space and cyber domains. It commands satellite information attack and defence forces, electronic assault forces and internet assault forces, campaign information operations forces, which include conventional electronic warfare forces, anti-radiation assault forces, and battlefield cyber warfare forces. All of this is available in the open domain. Now, Western states draw legitimacy from respect for the rules, conventions, and protocols of war. Where we see morals, ethics, and values as a centre of gravity, authoritarian rivals see them as an attractive target. And all of a sudden, the idea of lawfare becomes a helpful tool in their inventory. The term lawfare, of course, covers different meanings. In this context, though, it entered national security parlance when it appeared in a book called Unrestricted Warfare, written on military strategy in the late 1990s by 2 PLA officers, who used the term to refer to a nation's use of legalised international institutions to achieve strategic ends. But lawfare also applies to the challenge we have encountered in recent campaigns, where we need to update our legal, ethical and moral framework to properly hold our forces to account if they break the law, whilst ensuring they have appropriate freedom of action to seize fleeting opportunities on the battlefield. The COVID crisis has highlighted how the use of propaganda, data misuse, disinformation, and strategic influence is presenting complex and rapidly evolving challenges for researchers, for civil society, and of course for policymakers. And our autocratic rivals have utilised these techniques most effectively. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute is tracking how a range of actors are manipulating the information environment to exploit the COVID-19 crisis for strategic gain, including pro-Russian vaccine politics, whose disinformation narratives are designed to permeate anti-vaccination social media groups. Russia has used cyber and information attacks against its opponents regularly in the last few years. Notable examples included Ukraine's financial and energy sectors in 2017 and the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in 2018. Iran and North Korea are following suit. And the online National Security Forum, War on the Rocks, in their Digital Authoritarianism series, highlight Russia's hack and leak, Compromat operations, and the St. Petersburg-based Internet Research Agency troll farm which engages in sowing division abroad. The Wannacry ransom attack in May 2017 demonstrated how an attacker could rapidly achieve a global effect by spreading a virus through computers operating Microsoft Windows, holding users' files hostage and demanding a Bitcoin ransom in return. Now, this idea of digital authoritarianism also explores how the Chinese Communist Party is forging a future of mass surveillance and social credit scores, and is rapidly exporting these tools to other parts of the world. The recent Netflix documentary, A Social Dilemma, describes the way in which online interaction is subliminally influenced, leading to the audience becoming unwittingly controlled. Proxies, private military and security companies, and militias are back in fashion as well. The recent report by the US Center for Strategic and International Studies on the expansion of Russian PMSCs into security vacuums in parts of Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia is worth reflecting on. Using companies like the Wagner Group, Moscow can support state and non-state partners, extract resources, influence foreign leaders, and do so with plausible denial. Their military skills and capabilities lend a form of limited power projection, strengthening partners, establishing new military footholds, and altering regional balances to achieve strategic advantage. CSIS estimates that operations like these are underway in 30 countries across some 4 continents. Now, our rivals typically tailor their activities to remain below obvious detection and response thresholds, and they often rely on the speed, volume, and ubiquity of digital technology that characterises the present age. And with an increased emphasis on creativity, ambiguity, and amplifying the cognitive elements of war while dialing down the physical elements. Their way of warfare is strategic. It is synchronized and it is systematic, and our response must be too. None of our rivals can afford to go to war as we define it. They want to win below that threshold. However, the stakes are high. The traditional diplomatic instruments that have provided some measure of arms control and counter-proliferation have all but disappeared, with the last arms control treaty, New START, potentially ending next February. The upshot is that the threat of unwarranted escalation and therefore miscalculation between military protagonists is now clear and present. And as the competition for resources, bases, and partners intensifies, so the risks increase. The Horn of Africa is a case in point. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute sets out the growth of foreign military bases and a build-up of naval forces in the region since 2001, when the focus was on counter-terrorism, counter-piracy, and of course peace support operations in the wake of 9/11. Currently, a wide variety of international security actors operate from there. From Europe, the United States, the Middle East, the Gulf, and Asia, and international networks of military facilities and naval deployments together link the Horn to security developments in the Middle East, the Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and Asia Pacific, as well as other parts of Africa. The level of military engagement is matched in the Eastern Mediterranean, where the potential for misunderstanding is significant. And as we look down the barrel of a global recession, it's worth reflecting on how often financial crises lead to security crises. So, what should be our response to this ever more complex and dynamic strategic context? My view is that more of the same will not be enough. We must fundamentally change our thinking if we are not to be overwhelmed. Hence, we are launching this integrated operating concept. It has several big ideas. First, it makes a distinction between operating and warfighting. In an era of persistent competition, our deterrent posture needs to be more dynamically managed and modulated. This concept therefore introduces a fifth C, that of competition, to the traditional deterrence model of comprehension, credibility, capability, and communication. This recognises the need to compete below the threshold of war in order to deter war and to prevent one's adversaries from achieving their objectives in fait accompli strategies, as we've seen in the Crimea, Ukraine, Libya, and further afield. Competing involves a campaign posture that includes continuous operating on our terms and in places of our choosing. This requires a mindset that thinks in several dimensions to escalate and de-escalate up and down multiple ladders, as if it were a spider's web. One might actively constrain in the cyber domain to protect critical national infrastructure in the maritime domain. This campaign posture must be dynamically managed, and there must be a preparedness to allocate consistent means over longer-term horizons while adjusting the ways to anticipate a rival's response. The ways will include actions being communicated in a manner that may well test the traditional limits of statecraft. This posture will be engaged and forward deployed. Armed forces much more in use rather than dedicated solely for contingency, with training and exercising being delivered as operations. It will involve capacity building and engagement in support of countries that need our support. This could include partnered operations against common threats, particularly violent extremism, and this may well involve combat operation. It will also place a premium on building alliances and improving interoperability to make us more allied by design and thus able to burden share more productively. It is important to emphasise that the willingness to commit decisively hard capability with the credibility to warfight is an essential part of the ability to operate and therefore of deterrence. The second important idea is that we cannot afford any longer to operate in silos. We have to be integrated with allies, as I have described, across government, as a national enterprise, but particularly across the military instrument. Effective integration of maritime, land, air, space and cyber achieves a multi-domain effect that adds up to far more than simply the sum of the parts. Recognising, to paraphrase Omar Bradley, that the overall effect is only as powerful as the strength of the weakest domain. And third, we have to modernise. We must chart a direction of travel from an industrial age of platforms to an information age of systems. Warfare is increasingly about a competition between hiding and finding. It will be enabled at every level by a digital backbone into which all sensors, effectors, and deciders will be plugged. This means that some industrial age capabilities will increasingly have to meet their sunset to create the space for capabilities needed for sunrise. The trick is how you find a path through the night. We know this will require us to embrace combinations of information-centric technologies, but predicting these combinations will be challenging. We will have to take risk, accept some failure, and place emphasis on experimentation by allocating resources, force structure, training and exercise activity to stimulate innovation in all lines of development, with a responsive commercial function at the leading edge. This will enable adaptive exploitation as opportunities become clear and will allow better financial control. Throughout, we must recognise that the nature of war doesn't change. It is always visceral, it is always violent, and it always involves interaction between people. In the final analysis, one has to go close and personal with one's enemy. So, while this integrated operating concept places a premium on operating, it also places a premium on adaptability, the ability to adapt to warfight. And this, in turn, emphasises the importance of our people, who have always been and will always be our adaptive edge. Thank you for your attention.
Well, CDS, thanks for a terrific presentation, one that I found characteristically thoughtful, well considered.